It's been 3 days since the last successful hunt. The gathered berries ran out yesterday. The children are crying from hunger, and the adults are growing weak. For our prehistoric ancestors, this wasn't just a bad week. It was a life-or-death crisis that could wipe out an entire group. What they did next reveals the darkest, most desperate side of human survival instinct. Also, drop a comment telling us the city you're watching from. We love to see how far these stories travel. Archaeological evidence shows that prehistoric groups faced regular periods of starvation, sometimes lasting weeks or even months. When the usual food sources disappeared, our ancestors had to make choices that horrify us today. But these weren't acts of savagery. They were calculated survival strategies developed over thousands of years. When traditional prey became scarce, prehistoric humans turned to creatures we'd never consider eating: insects, grubs, worms, and larvae. Archaeological sites are filled with evidence of mass insect consumption. Termite mounds show signs of systematic harvest, and bone tools specifically designed for extracting grubs from rotting logs have been found across multiple continents. They ate the contents of animal stomachs, including partially digested plant matter that provided crucial nutrients. They consumed blood, both fresh and coagulated, as a protein source. They even ate the soft marrow from bones they'd already cracked open for previous meals, scraping every possible calorie from resources they'd normally discard. When food became critically scarce, prehistoric humans didn't just hunt animals, they consumed every part of them. Bones show evidence of being cracked open multiple times, scraped clean, and even boiled to extract the last traces of nutrients. Even the smallest bones, like those from fingers and toes, were processed for their minimal marrow content. Sites across Europe, Africa, and the Americas show unmistakable signs of human bones being processed exactly like animal bone. Cut marks from stone tools, evidence of marrow extraction, and even cooking marks. This wasn't ritual cannibalism or warfare. It was survival cannibalism practiced by groups facing starvation. The bones were processed with the same techniques used on systematic dismemberment, defleshing, and marrow extraction. Similar evidence has been found at sites like Gough's Cave in England and various locations in Spain. The pattern is unmistakable and widespread. But cannibalism wasn't random or chaotic. Archaeological evidence suggests it followed specific social rules and hierarchy. Certain individuals were more likely to be consumed than others, usually those who had already died from starvation or illness, rather than healthy group members being killed for food. This suggests that even in the most desperate circumstances, prehistoric humans maintained some social structures and moral boundaries. Evidence from cave art and burial practices suggests that groups who resorted to cannibalism often developed specific rituals and ceremonies to cope with the psychological trauma. Some cave paintings seem to depict scenes of starvation and desperation, while certain burial practices suggest efforts to honor those who were consumed for group survival. They practiced what we might call selective abandonment, leaving behind the weakest members of the group to increase the survival chances of the stronger ones. Archaeological evidence suggests that elderly individuals, seriously injured people, and sometimes even children were left behind when groups couldn't support everyone during food crises. A group carrying weak members moved slower, consumed more of their limited resources, and had lower chances of finding new food sources. By reducing group size, the remaining members had better odds of survival. Skeletal remains found isolated from group burial sites often show evidence of starvation and abandonment, telling the heartbreaking story of individuals left to die alone. Some groups practiced what archaeologists call resource hoard, concentrating the remaining food on the most valuable group members. This meant that hunters, fertile women, and healthy children received larger portions, while others received minimal nutrition. Skeletal analysis shows that during food crises, some individuals maintained relatively good health, while others showed severe signs of malnutrition, suggesting deliberate food allocation decisions. The lengths to which prehistoric humans went to extract every possible calorie from their environment is truly shocking. They consumed tree bark, roots, and even certain types of clay that contained mineral. They learned to process normally toxic plants through elaborate preparation methods, soaking, fermentation, and cooking techniques that could take days but rendered poisonous plants edible. Archaeological evidence shows that desperate groups would spend enormous amounts of energy processing foods that provided minimal nutrition. They would collect and process pine needles for their vitamin C content, scrape lichen from rocks for carbohydrates, and even collect and eat certain types of fungus that grew on rotting wood. These activities often consumed more energy than they provided, but they kept people alive long enough to potentially find better food sources. They extended their active hunting hours, pursuing prey through the night despite the enormous dangers. They traveled much greater distances in search of food, sometimes covering hundreds of miles. Archaeological evidence suggests that some groups essentially became nomadic during food crises, abandoning their traditional territories entirely in desperate searches for sustenance. Groups would attempt to take down prey that was normally too dangerous to hunt, massive predator, aggressive animal, or creatures that were extremely difficult to kill. Archaeological sites show evidence of humans attacking cave bears, lions, and other apex predators that they would normally avoid. Many of these attempts ended in disaster, with human remains showing evidence of fatal encounters with dangerous prey. Evidence suggests that prehistoric humans would chase wolves, hyenas, and even large cats away from their fresh kills, stealing carcasses despite the enormous risks. This behavior often resulted in serious injuries or death, but the alternative was starvation. The social dynamics within starving groups became increasingly complex and brutal. Archaeological evidence suggests that during extreme food shortages, group leadership often shifted to individuals who could provide food, regardless of their previous social status. Women who were skilled at finding edible plants might suddenly become group leaders, while traditional hunters who couldn't find game lost their authority. Skeletal remains from some sites show evidence of violence between group members, injuries that suggest fighting over food resources. Some individuals show signs of being killed by their own group members, possibly for attempting to hoard food or for being perceived as too weak to contribute to survival efforts. Archaeological evidence suggests that during extreme starvation, groups would sometimes kill infants who were too young to survive the crisis, concentrating resources on older children who had better survival chances. This practice, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, was a calculated decision to maximize the number of group members who could survive the crisis. Evidence suggests that some groups would deliberately induce miscarriages during food shortages, recognizing that pregnancy consumed crucial resources that might mean the difference between life and death for existing. Skeletal remains of pregnant women from starvation periods often show evidence of malnutrition so severe that natural miscarriage was common. Cave art from periods following known food crises often depicts scenes of abundance and plenty, suggesting that groups who survived starvation developed intense psychological associations with food security. Some burial practices seem designed to ensure that the deceased would have food in the afterlife, possibly reflecting trauma from watching group members starve. Archaeological evidence also suggests that surviving groups developed increasingly sophisticated food storage and preservation techniques following starvation events. They built more elaborate food caches, developed better methods for preserving meat and plant materials, and created more complex social systems for sharing resources during abundant periods. Groups that had consumed everything, including normally inedible materials, often suffered from severe digestive problems and nutritional deficiencies. Some individuals who survived the initial starvation period died weeks or months later from the long-term effects of malnutrition and the consumption of inappropriate foods. Perhaps most remarkably, archaeological evidence suggests that groups who survived extreme food shortages often emerged with stronger social bonds and more sophisticated survival strategies. The shared trauma of near starvation created intense group loyalty, while the experience of extreme desperation led to innovations in food procurement, processing, and storage that benefited future generations. The sites where these survival events occurred often became important locations for future groups. Archaeological evidence shows that many locations with evidence of cannibalism and extreme survival strategies were repeatedly occupied by different groups over thousands of years. These sites may have served as reminders of the importance of food security and the consequences of poor resource management. They were willing to cross moral boundaries, endure psychological trauma, and make impossible choices to ensure the survival of their groups. These weren't savage acts. They were calculated survival strategies employed by intelligent beings facing impossible circumstances. The development of these extreme survival strategies shows a level of strategic thinking that challenges our assumptions about prehistoric intelligence. Groups that survived repeated food crises developed increasingly sophisticated protocols for resource management during abundant periods. They created detailed mental maps of emergency food sources, developed complex social hierarchies for resource distribution, and even established intergroup agreements for mutual aid during crises. Archaeological evidence suggests that some groups developed what we might call starvation protocols, predetermined plans for who would be abandoned first, how resources would be distributed, and even which individuals might be considered for consumption if they died naturally. These weren't spontaneous decisions made in desperation. They were carefully planned strategies developed through generations of survival experience. Archaeological sites show evidence of specialized tools for extracting insects, processing tree bark, and breaking down normally inedible materials. These innovations, born from desperation, became permanent additions to prehistoric technology. Some groups developed techniques for preserving human flesh, just as they did for animal meat. Archaeological evidence suggests that during extreme food shortages, when cannibalism became necessary, groups would smoke, dry, and even ferment human remains to make them last longer. This level of systematic food processing, even of human remains, demonstrates the calculated nature of these survival strategies. Evidence suggests they created elaborate justification systems, often involving spiritual or religious elements, to make these actions psychologically bearable. Some cave art seems to depict cannibalistic scenes as necessary sacrifice or spiritual transformations rather than simply acts of desperation. Archaeological evidence suggests that individuals who experienced extreme food shortages as children became obsessive food hoarders as adults, creating massive personal caches that they would defend violently. These behavioral patterns could persist for decades after the original crisis. The social structures that emerged from starvation events often became permanent features of prehistoric society. Groups that survived extreme food shortages frequently developed more rigid hierarchy, with food distribution becoming a primary source of social power. Archaeological evidence shows that some societies developed complex systems of food debt and obligation that could last for generations. Archaeological sites often show evidence of elaborate seasonal ceremonies and preparations that seem designed to prevent future food crises. These preparations could consume enormous amounts of time and resources, but they were considered essential for group survival. The genetic legacy of these survival strategies may still influence human behavior today. Some researchers suggest that our modern tendency toward food hoarding, our psychological discomfort with waste, and our complex social relationships around food sharing all trace back to these prehistoric survival experiences. The ancestors who survived extreme food shortages passed on not just their genes, but their survival behavior. The desperate measures taken by prehistoric humans during food shortages remind us that survival is never guaranteed, and that the comfortable abundance we take for granted is a recent development in human history. We're exploring the hidden and often brutal realities of prehistoric life, revealing that our ancestors were capable of both remarkable ingenuity and shocking desperation. Like this video, share it with someone who'd find it interesting, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.